Edgar Daniel Nixon, otherwise known as E.D. Nixon, was born on July 12, 1899, in Lowndes County, Alabama, to his parents Sue Ann Chappell and Wesley M. Nixon. Nixon's mother died when he was just a boy. He later lived in Montgomery during his teen years, and he grew up to be a young man who found employment working as a pullman porter towards the beginning of the 1920s. Nixon became involved with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, an African-American union founded and president over by A. Philip Rudolph. The BSCP president inspired Nixon to action, and he went on to become the leader of the BSCP Alabama branch and a thoughtful, empowering community activist who largely influenced the civil rights movement. During the 1940s, E.D. Nixon wrote a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt, calling for an establishment of a USO club for African-American servicemen. She took action on his request, and the two later coincidentally met when she was riding on a train and he was working as a porter. Nixon had also helped to organize the Montgomery Voters League, becoming its president and leading a march of more than 700 citizens to the Montgomery County Municipal Courthouse, calling for an end to the unfair practices that blocked African-American voting rights. Around the same time, Nixon was elected to head the Montgomery chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, otherwise known as the NAACP. He later became president of the organization's entire Alabama branch. Nixon started to run for county office in 1954, the same year he was chosen as the Alabama Journal's Man of the Year. He lost the election only by a slim margin. Nixon was looking for a way to formally challenge the city segregation laws. On December 1st, 1955, when fellow NAACP member Rosa Parks refused once again to surrender her seat on the bus to a white passenger, she was arrested. However, Nixon played a key role in providing bail for Parks, and he also enlisted the aid of white attorney Clifford Durr and his spouse Virginia. Nixon believed that the event could spur a boycott of the area's bus lines and be processed via legal channels. He also enlisted the aid of a new young preacher at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to help lead the boycott. As a result, Nixon, King, and Minister Ralph D. Abernathy helped to form the Montgomery Improvement Association, with Nixon serving as treasurer. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted for more than 380 days, with the African American community enduring a host of travails that included harassment and violent attacks. Shortly after, Nixon's home was firebombed 2 days after King's, and he was indicted for violating a state anti-boycott statute. Yet the boycott persevered, and the city was eventually forced to lift its bus segregation laws. Not only did Rosa Parks assist Nixon in the Montgomery bus boycott, being his assistant in the NAACP, she worked with Nixon on a huge number of assignments dealing with a record of incidents in which the African American community had been violently attacked by racists. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks received worldwide attention. Nixon was left in the dark, fading into the background, but chose to remain out of the spotlight and to devote himself to other civil rights issues. As president of the NAACP, Nixon had devoted attention to the voter registration struggle, and he tried to get as many African Americans to register to vote as he can. And in the late 1960s, Nixon had added responsibility as the recreation director of a public housing project. Of course, it pushed him further into the background, but of course it didn't concern Nixon at all. He always considered himself just a soldier in the battle, not the general. Although Nixon had a lot to do with the Montgomery boycott, segregation, and fighting for African American voting rights, he did seek a lot of time to take care of his family. Nixon had his first son, Edgar Daniel Nixon Jr., with his first wife Elise, who unfortunately died in 1934, but shortly after that, he had married his second wife Arlette, who has been seen by his side throughout his fight for African American rights. Nixon's son, E.D. Nixon Jr., became a noted actor under the name Nick Latour, and later died in 2011. In recognition of Nixon's efforts in the civil rights movement, he was asked to speak at a civil rights rally in Madison Square Garden in New York in May 1956. However, Nixon clashed with other national leaders of the NAACP. He was a blue-collar laborer, probably an atheist, and a long-time union organizer. He resented the organization's new leaders, many of whom were educated clergy members and from the African American middle class. Although Nixon supported the efforts of Martin Luther King Jr., he felt that his own contributions to the civil rights movement in Montgomery, which had spanned some 40 years, had been slighted. In protest, he resigned from the NAACP in November 1957 and returned to local community organizing in Montgomery. In the 1970s, Nixon increasingly complained that accounts of the civil rights movement had overlooked his efforts. Later, on February 25, 1987, Nixon died in Montgomery. Although Nixon is a forgotten hero of the civil rights movement, We will never forget the huge lasting impact he had.